Good morning, everyone, and fantastic to be here this morning. And this opportunity from Findacure to be able to talk together with Rachael is a fantastic chance for us to actually show the collaboration that is possible between two very distinct charities, but different purposes, but we obviously have a shared community interest. So it's great to be here this morning. Thank you for the invitation. So hopes, fears and tears, lots of all of that in the presentation. But first of all, just to point out, we have a new logo which we've you was just seeing for the first time today, the Rett Disorders Alliance UK. So we have Reverse Rett and Rett UK, but we also have Fox G1 UK, which are a much smaller charity, but has a genetic disorder with very similar symptoms to Rett syndrome. So we work with them as well. So firstly, I think it's important that we just, for the audience, some of you will be familiar with Rett syndrome, but probably the majority aren't. So just a quick run over what Rett syndrome is. So it is a complex neurological disorder. It is present at birth, but it's not immediately apparent. So it affects around 1 in 40,000 boys, but 1 in 12,000 females. The reason being that that's a fault on the X chromosome, so it's much more common in girls. The prevalence rate, say 1 in 12,000, it's actually the second most common cause of profound disability in females after Down syndrome. So we're actually one of the more common rare disorders. There are disorders here today I know are much rarer than that. Rett syndrome has multiple comorbidities. Some of those are apparent fairly on after a period of near normal development. The girls go through a regression, and at that point, a lot of these comorbidities start to actually show. And that can be epilepsy, scoliosis, but one of the most debilitating parts of the syndrome is the breathing disruption, which is where I hand over to Rachael, and she's going to talk to you about the breathing and how the Cerizatan trial has actually come about.
So after hearing about Rett syndrome and all the various symptoms that are involved, the way that children are born healthy and then develop this disease within the first couple of years of life and then lose so many skills, people might be wondering why irregular breathing patterns really make a significant difference to the lives of these people. I mean, many times people with Rett syndrome can't speak, they can't use their hands, they can't walk a lot of the time, they have trouble with controlled movements, and so the breathing is irregular, so what? Well, people with Rett syndrome suffer from all of these different kinds of breathing problems. They're very variable across patients, and the literature is very not very precise about this, so that until the last sort of 10 or 20 years, there's not really been a lot of information. Many times, even in natural history studies, this problem will be given about 1 paragraph. But this is a problem that can really impact people's lives. For people with typical kind of apneas that you see in Rett syndrome or hyperventilation, what you're talking about is somebody who in a period of about 5 minutes will have 10 episodes where, imagine you're being dunked into water and you're having to hold your breath, and then that goes on for 20 to 30 seconds, and then one big gasp, and then you might go straight into another apnea. Or you have people that are in like a constant state of panic attack, or you can have people who have more of a very shallow breathing, which again affects them every day and also in the long term. So because we knew that we wanted to reverse Rett to support any emerging clinical trials to do with this breathing problem, we wanted to establish why it was important to patients and families, because a lot of the time even the families won't realize that. But what happens is, I think, as a parent of a daughter with Rett syndrome, and I think this is true of parents of children with lots of rare diseases, you start to normalize things that aren't normal, that aren't acceptable, because that's how it is and you have to live somehow. And you won't necessarily even be noticing that this problem is ongoing. So we sent out a questionnaire in collaboration with Professor Santosh to look at what the impact of the breathing problem is on the patient's well-being, according to the families, because the patients often can't answer for themselves, usually can't answer for themselves, and also on the caregiver's quality of life. So what we were finding is that people were saying, if the person has this breathing problem, then even though they can't put their own coat on, somebody else putting their coat on is a problem during an apnea, so you'll have to wait till they breathe or give them a poke. Then you can put their coat on, and then if they go into another one, you have to stop. Same with things like eating, it's very hard to swallow if you're going like this. So these are things that we were able to establish through this survey. Also, it's very stressful for the family. So everybody knows how important it is to breathe evenly, and we all adjust our breathing, hopefully, in stressful situations. And these people with Rett syndrome often have high anxiety levels anyway, and then on top of it, they have this disrupted breathing. So if you're with somebody who's not breathing very well, you can end up taking on this similar breathing pattern or finding yourself holding your breath. So this is a problem that's happening to the families because the patient has the breathing problem. But also it affects people's stress levels, because we're finding that people are very concerned about the long-term effects of the breathing problem. What is this doing to her blood gases? How does she feel? And what does it mean in terms of things like sudden death, which does occur in Rett syndrome. So recent publications have come out that show that the prognosis for Rett syndrome is actually much better than was previously thought. So it was previously thought to be a degenerative disease and that people died early. And what we know now is that, and this is from publications that have come out of the US natural history study, that people with Rett syndrome can live longer lives if they have access to adequate health care. But most of the deaths in Rett syndrome, and we're talking about combined causes of death, but all linked to cardiorespiratory compromise, that's about 52% of the causes of death in Rett syndrome. So it's clear that something needs to be done to address this problem, which is connected to that in the long term. So the first UK clinical trial for Rett syndrome was something that aims to address this problem. It's sponsored by the pharmaceutical company Neuron, who I'm glad to say are here today. I heard Rick say in the opening that it's really important to try and break down barriers between patient groups and patients and industry. And I'm really grateful that Neuron have been interested in speaking to both our organisations and other patient groups worldwide from the outset. And I think that's been beneficial to them and to us and to the patients. So this drug is a repurposed drug. It was trialled initially in Parkinson's disease, so it has an established safety profile, and it had strong preclinical data in mouse models of Rett syndrome. In this trial is a multi-center international trial, so there's 15 trial sites across the world, and then we have, just our one in the UK. I think in all the other countries it's more than 2. So from a reverse Rett point of view, Reverse Rett was founded in 2010. I'm a co-founder, and the main purpose of founding Reverse Rett was to have a patient group that was completely focused on accelerating treatments and a cure for Rett syndrome. And we did this predominantly through fundraising for research and delivering funds to international research. But in the last few years, as more and more potential treatments were emerging, we started to see that we needed to do something to facilitate the success of clinical trials in the clinical context of the disease being mainly managed with non-biological care. So things like speech therapy, physio, feeding tubes, but not necessarily being targeted systematically with drugs. And so we were coming into this situation with clinicians who were focused on that side of things rather than on driving change and seeing, even the attitude of people being treated rather than managed and oh dear, make her comfortable and off you go. So we started to work with Professor Santosh at King's, who is a psychopharmacologist, but very focused on rare diseases in general. He runs a national centre for pharmacology and rare diseases, and we did some seed funding with him to get him focused on Rett syndrome and to nurture his interest. And then the other thing that happened that was a significant event for me was I came to a Findacure meeting, a bit like this one, might have been a bit smaller, but a great lady was there, Christine Lavery from the MPS Society. She was talking about patient registries and why it was important to have a patient registry, and how you can actually build one without having a lot of money and a lot of infrastructure. And so that's something that we did, and I think that's been beneficial in the long term, which we'll talk about more in a minute. Wrong way. So the reason it was very important for us to focus on this first UK trial for Rett syndrome is because we have no approved drugs, and these are people who are struggling with this symptom every day, all of their waking life, basically, with no treatment. We wanted to make sure that as quickly as possible, people with Rett syndrome had access to this as an emerging treatment, because otherwise we'd be watching people in other countries having access to, a drug that potentially helps, and not having access to it ourselves, and we didn't want to wait several years. So there was a lot riding on this clinical trial, basically. We wanted to make sure that it was obvious that we could manage clinical trials in the UK for Rett, so that in the future, as more and more positive things emerge, they'll happen here. This has been a collaboration. As I said a few minutes ago, the trial is sponsored by Neuron Pharmaceuticals, but it involved several agencies working in partnership as well. So King's, obviously, also King's College Hospital, the Maudsley Hospital where Professor Santosh runs his outpatient clinic, also the clinical trials facility at King's, which is where people came to the study visits. And then also the partnership between Rett UK and Reverse Rett has been important, and I think that our involvement, our personal involvement, and also the ongoing dialogue between us has enabled both organisations to use the information, knowledge and experience to benefit patients. So before the trial started, a lot of the work happened before the trial started. So one thing that happened about 6 months before the trial started was King's were struggling about whether they were going to sign off on it, and it's because, as I've said, Professor Santosh runs an outpatient clinic, so he didn't, and it's separate from his sort of research piece, and there's a lot involved with bringing the logistics together, and one thing they were uncomfortable with was the lack of admin support or even a research support, so that somebody would be organising study visits and things like that. They didn't feel that that was there, so something that we did at Reverse Rett was funded a clinical trial coordinator who was put in place to be based there at King's, and that position is ongoing now. A lot of the times with clinical trials, not that I have enormous experience because I don't, this is the only clinical trial I've ever been involved with, but it seems to me that a lot of the times with these kinds of trials, the industry and partners and hospitals and doctors will put out a general call to patients. And we didn't do that with this clinical trial at Reverse Rett. What we decided to do was to use our patient registry and to go proactively to the families. And the reason we did this is because most of our families are hanging on by a very thin thread. We're already very overwhelmed. Nobody needs any more jobs to do, papers to read, or forms to fill out. We needed to make it as simple as possible, so we basically went to families in the designated age group that we were looking for and asked them, does your child have breathing irregularities, yes or no? You can answer this with yes or no in the subject line. And then those came back, and then we said, would you be interested, you've said your family member has breathing irregularities, would you be interested in a clinical trial, yes or no? and then they came back, and then we moved on to pre-screening. So we did these pre-screening calls, which was really just to help the trial site. So we didn't want to, and families as well, because we didn't want to waste anybody's time and energy or hope in bringing them down to a extensive screening and making them go through the journey and the building up of expectations if there was something small that we could have caught at an earlier stage. So there's small details that would be important to Rett families, which other people might not share, but because we're families ourselves, we're able to point certain things out to people. So one thing, for example, that was a slight issue is that when we first started the UK arm of the trial, we were looking at only patients over the age of 17 because we didn't have a paediatric nurse in place, side detail. But what this meant was we were in an age group of, we're basically in childbearing age group now. For a hospital to say to a family of a girl with Rett syndrome, your child is going to need to go on contraception, is going to be difficult. It's very sensitive. You're talking about people who are not able to speak. They have not very much autonomy. A lot of time they can't move independently. It's an awkward thing to approach. And so that was something that needed to be discussed, and no pressure, and talked about backwards and forwards to help people become comfortable with it and not put off at the first moment. So it gave the families a chance to make more of an informed decision. Now, one of the great things about our partnership with Neuron is they've worked with us on travel and accommodation arrangements for families. But one of the other things that we did was we went and checked out the clinical trials facilities. So you can see here, this room, very nice. That's the kind of room that, I won't say healthy, but not people with Rett syndrome might go to clinical trial in, like maybe the general public, healthy volunteers. There's chairs. You might be in with a number of other disease groups or other healthy volunteers. That's not right for people with Rett syndrome. So that was the first thing. And the great thing about having the involvement with the trial site and with Neuron is the ability to say, actually, this room's not right. It's about having the leverage to say, these people will need a bed, even though they're only there for the day. They need a screen around the bed for privacy and dignity purposes. And then, so that was brilliant, and that's been ongoing in lots of different ways. And then also with Neuron provide us with funds to set up travel and accommodation arrangements for families. One of the things that's been really brilliant is that they didn't put loads of restrictions on that, which enabled us to be really focused on the patients and the families and look at what people on an individual level needed. You know, it's not about everybody gets X, it's about talking to the family and making sure we understand what their requirements are. So the clinical trial is now internationally at capacity, which is great news. The numbers in the UK are, I think we've had 22 patients in total that have gone active on the trial. I think we have 8 in the extension period and 4 who are still active on the trial, and we continue to provide that logistical support in travel arrangements and organising meal expenses, etc. Some of that work is ongoing even with patients that were screened and who failed. So, for example, one person that went to the screening and failed the screening died recently. So obviously we have ongoing contact with that family, and there's other families who have, and when they fail the screen, it's not because they don't have bad enough breathing problems, it's sometimes more often because they're too bad. So we have ongoing contact with them as well. But, and the other thing I should say is we are now working in partnership with Rett UK and Neuron to look at issues around bringing the drug to market once we see whether the trial is successful or not. So we've learned a lot during this process about what patient groups can do to help make trials successful in disease groups like ours, which are small and we don't have a lot of resource behind us. And we've learned a lot about the importance of having a good relationship with the industry partners. We've learned more about how important it is that patient groups can try and come together and work effectively together, although that is a challenge, not for me personally, but like across the board. Everybody knows, you know, internationally across different patient groups, sometimes that's difficult. I think we've managed to work with it. But ultimately, whatever we can do to make clinical trials successful for rare diseases, we rely on patients and families to be brave enough to put themselves forward. And now Becky, I'm handing over to Becky, so Becky can tell you about personal experience of being involved.
Okay, so the reality, and Rachel could have done this part as well because Rachel's daughter's also on the trial, but it's a good way of splitting this up. So the reality then, Rachel mentioned part of the screening process. The initial screening is a telephone call, which is straightforward enough. Then you get the paperwork, and the paperwork, the protocol is substantial, reams and reams of paper. And as a parent of a child with a rare disorder, we're used to that. I think when you can give birth, you might as well get the filing cabinet as well. But so a lot of paperwork. Conversations around contraception, as Rachel mentioned, it was a requirement that my daughter went onto the pill. And that necessitated a conversation with a GP about her mental capacity, one which we hadn't broached before, and I never thought I would have a conversation with anyone about my daughter going on the pill, so that was quite an interesting angle. But fortunately, the GP was supportive. She's known us well and long enough to know that I would be making it in Rosie's best interest, so that was the decision that we made. Travel, even though we live in Brighton, Brighton to London, if you're driving it and you need to be there for 9 or 9:30 in the morning, it's still a 2 or 3 hour drive. Not relying on the trains, because invariably you get to a station and the lift isn't working, so we ended up driving. So, you know, travel is a consideration, and we live fairly close, but people were coming from all over the UK. So lots of early starts. It's not just getting up out of bed and leaving the house with your handbag. It's 2 hours before you can leave the house from when you get up, the time you've got somebody else dressed, washed, etc., and ready to go. As Rachel said, the clinic facilities were first class. We were really lucky that Rachel had done that footwork. She'd been there, she checked it all out. We knew what we were going to have at our disposal. There was a side room where a parent could stay if we were staying overnight. So it really was the best facilities that we could have asked for. They had the hoist in place, which was necessary as well. The people there were amazing, great collaborative work from lots of different people, but very compassionate, very empathetic, and really making an effort to actually talk to the person with Rett syndrome, not talk over them, which is really important. Blood draws, first lot of tears. People with Rett syndrome generally have very small veins that collapse really easily, and the trial itself involves a lot of blood draws even. Fortunately, Reverse Rett put the funding up to buy one of these vein viewers, which I don't know if people have seen them before, are fantastic for this type of thing. So really non-invasive in terms of the vein viewer, but at least they can actually got a better chance of getting in first time and getting the blood that they need. So some of the other things that we witnessed, Rachel had mentioned about the increased anxiety for people with Rett syndrome. So people with Rett syndrome often operate on a fight or flight basis, and things that you and I would deal with on a normal day-to-day basis is actually quite problematic for them, and they will sort of have a very heightened anxiety reaction to things. So being in a clinic and being surrounded by new people and being poked and prodded throughout the day increases anxiety, and the anxiety then increases the breathing problems. For myself, working full-time and taking time off, that was quite difficult to manage because I needed to catch up with things. And the days were long, certainly initially. The first few months that we were there from 9 till 6 or 7, and then sometimes we were staying overnight as well. So there was quite a lot involved. Fortunately, my other 2 children are older, so I haven't got to do school runs and manage that side of things. But for families who have got to do that, it's another consideration. Lots of questions when you're there. You certainly left knowing that you'd actually had a full day. Questions about, has their breathing changed? What's the anxiety like? What's the seizures like? How have they been generally? And as Rachel says, we're dealing with this stuff all day, every day. So you kind of just take it, it's kind of hamster on the wheel, you're just getting on with it. And it's only when you sort of step out of that slightly that you actually then start thinking, oh yeah, what it was like yesterday, or what was it like the week before, and trying to remember those things. So lots of form filling and answering questions. And one of the most joyous parts of the whole trial was the bio-recording. So similar to the kit that the girl in the photo is wearing here, without the oxygen nasal tube, but like a sleep system. So for 3 consecutive days prior to each trial visit, my daughter had to wear this kit, and she wears a spinal jacket normally because she's got scoliosis, which is quite severe. So we had to make that compromise about taking the spinal jacket off. Potentially, was that going to make her spine worse? We hoped not. But that was a prerequisite of the trial to do the recording. So for 3 days, for 6 hours a day, she had to wear the kit, which is linked to a radio. And if they have an episode like a seizure, or if they're eating or drinking, or it's personal care, you have to pause the recording. You have to make a note on a paper diary, and at the end of each day you then upload your diary and you upload your recording to a secure portal, which is on a website link they've already given you. So a parent needs to be reasonably competent about what they're doing with that kind of technology. Obviously there was training within the clinic itself, but you need a certain level of competence to sort of do that. Not that it was difficult, but the other thing you had to make sure you do, obviously, if you're not around as a parent, that you've actually then trained somebody else to be able to do those bio-recordings and diarise things and manage that side of things. So there's an element of training involved in that. Some of the hiccups, unscheduled visits. So if things weren't going completely to plan, and there was close monitoring throughout the visits, including with telephone calls, but if things weren't going to plan, then you might have an unscheduled visit, so back to the clinic, and that could be sort of at short notice. Adverse events. So again, close monitoring throughout, but if something does go wrong, and this happened to us recently, my daughter has a suspected gastro issue, which has only just come up, but it meant she was in hospital for 3 nights. It was making her seizures worse. We actually had to take her off the drug, and she's still off it at the moment, even though she's been on it now for the best part of 18 months. We still have had to pause the drug. She's got to have a review by the gastro team, and then hopefully it will be a visit back to the clinic, and we'll actually get her back on the drug. So we think it's highly unlikely that this was linked to the drug itself, because she's been on it so long and she'd been doing really, really well on it. But we still had to follow the protocol, and she had to come off the drug. Dare I mention it, Brexit? We don't know what's going to happen. It's a fear. In as much as we know the drug comes from Italy, is there going to be a hiccup in terms of the supply for that drug for those that are on the trial, and for hopefully if the drug is approved later this year, that will that supply chain be interrupted at all? We don't know. Nobody knows. What happens next? So we're expecting that the results of the trial are going to be made available in the last quarter of this year, and I know Dennis Dion from Neuron is here, so he can give more information about that. But hopefully when those results are approved, that they're positive, that the drug will be made available more widely than through the NHS, and the families will benefit from that. And that's announcing the results. So we don't know how long that may take then for the drug to be actually licensed, and we also don't know whether cost is going to be an issue. We'd like to think not, but NICE have still got to be able to approve the cost of this. And looking at the long-term safety and effects of the drug, so my daughter's been on it now for the best part of 18 months. As far as we know, we've not had an adverse effect that's actually directly related to the drug. It was well tested in terms of a population of people with schizophrenia and Parkinson's before it actually was used for Rett Syndrome. So it had a good track record in that respect. But longer term, do we know what that's going to look like? And will the drug become tolerated by the population of people with Rett Syndrome after a longer term? We don't know that either. So there's always going to be some questions around that. Has it been worth it? I have to say that's a resounding yes. Obviously, we can't talk about the outcomes and any differences we might have seen at this stage, But certainly from the whole experience of my daughter being involved, one of the things which our parents in the room will be familiar with in terms of being a parent of a child with a rare disorder is actually, particularly when you get into adult services, who is actually overseeing that child's care or your child's care. You'll bounce from the paediatrician to the GP, who probably has never met the child at that stage, and suddenly they are responsible for their care. There's very little monitoring of that person, maybe an annual visit, a health check, but the benefit of being involved in the trial was that actually we had very thorough monitoring. Every 3 months we were back at the clinic, they were doing a full blood count, they were looking at heart rate, so the ECG was measured each time. So those sort of things were really good. And I know personally, although my daughter didn't have any problems on the trial, there were other families there that have been, say, urinary infections have been picked up, which they hadn't noticed before. So those sort of things could be dealt with and treated, which was really good. So that's been a real positive in terms of that additional level of monitoring. And I think also professionally as well, so as the CEO of the patient support charity, it's been really useful for me to actually understand the whole process from start to beginning, what's involved, and then we know there are future trials coming up for Rett Syndrome, and we're able to communicate that with our families and actually tell the story really exactly what you expect and what's going to be involved. So that's, from that point of view, it's been really good as well. We've had obviously access to the drug. So it was a 24 weeks double-blind placebo initially, and at the end of the 24 weeks then everybody went on to the drug. So we knew we were going to get the drug. So we're ahead of the game, and that's been a huge benefit for us. And just quickly then about Rett UK. So Rett UK's purpose is it's a national charity dedicated to supporting and empowering people with Rett syndrome and their families. And our vision is that everyone with Rett syndrome is given every possible opportunity to achieve their individual potential and live life to their full. And that means access to drugs and therapies like Sirizitan. So we're really delighted to be able to be involved and delighted to work with Reverse Rett, and any opportunity we can to collaborate, we will make the most of that. Just some citations here for some of the things that Rachel was talking about.
I just wanted to add, things like Becky's personal involvement in the trial has also been really helpful in terms of, although Reverse Rett were able to fund the vein viewer, it was Becky that brought the vein viewer to my attention. I know about the blood draws and how awful they are, but I didn't know about this piece of equipment. So things like that, where we are able to share information and discuss, are of benefit to everybody. So thank you, Becky.
Thank you. Thank you.